they've been anthropomorphized pretty much since people first started seeing images of the penguin, drawn up in caricatures like a little waiter. So they've been used in many different ways, particularly in adverts that are showing on the television because of the way that they're moving often. I've got quite a few adverts in my collection that I actually film once, standing in for people. In terms of the print ads, generally when they are showing the penguins, it's not so much standing for a person as standing for the Antarctic environment. So that's a bit of a difference between the two media that I've seen so far. In the print ads, tends to be penguin equals Antarctic landscape, and in the ads that are filmed, often that penguin will take on more human characteristics or be shown playing a human role, like delivering a diamond to its partner instead of a little stone, for instance, in an ad for a jeweler. Sort of depends on the medium.
Thank you. Is there any more questions for Hannah? Well, in that case, well, we're going to wait for 10 minutes so we sort of keep our schedule. So if in the next 10 minutes a question occurs to you, then please just ask it. Otherwise, we have a small 10-minute break.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone out there does notice any of those adverts in your own country, it would be great if you would be able to let me know about them, because I am still collecting a lot, and it's difficult to know what's out there in the whole wide world, especially when you're down here at the end of the world in Tasmania, another little gateway to Antarctica.
Well, I have one more short question. Would you think that the advertisements are different for connecting with the North Pole and the South Pole, and would you always know if the ad is referring? I mean, obviously, if they're penguins or polar bears, it would be obvious, but sometimes the reference might just be vague to some kind of polar world.
That's a very good question, and you're quite right. There are a whole number of adverts out there that are using a very generic polar landscape that could be interpreted as North Pole or as South Pole, and generally the marker that you would see in that landscape to know which hemisphere it is would be, as you pointed out, the penguin down south or the polar bear up in the north. So sometimes it does depend just where this ad appeared. Sometimes it also just depends on the title of the campaign. You'll be able to see on the screen still down in the corner that advert with the cow. So advert for the fridge with the cow in a polar landscape. And this was an example of one that didn't really have anything to say, is this Antarctic? Is this somewhere else? In this case, it was just the name of the campaign. So in the absence of those markers, penguin, polar bear, can be difficult to know sometimes, but that's also an interesting area to look at in its own right. There's a scholar called Judith Williamson. I had a quote from her earlier, and she's done quite a lot of work about how those generic polar landscapes have been used to sell different products and really push environmental angle as well. So that very question of is it Arctic, is it Antarctic, is it generic polar, is going to form a part of my project, but it's a really interesting question to address in its own right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we've got two more questions here. One from Vartika. Are the adverts portraying Antarctica the way they should be?
So the question was, are the adverts portraying Antarctica the way they should be?
Yes.
Well, my question would be, what way should Antarctica be portrayed? That really depends on the person who's asking the question and the agenda of the person asking the question. Is it how it should be portrayed to someone who would like to draw on those ideas of purity to tell, say, a type of water or beer? Then it will be, you'll have different imagery to if you're wanting to portray Antarctica as somewhere that's very, very extreme and harsh, say if you're advertising outdoor gear and jacket. I would say there's not one way to represent Antarctica, and there's not really one way that you should be representing it either. What we can only look at is what sort of representations are out there.
Okay, and then we have a question here again from Daniela. Have you seen any advertisements that depict Antarctica as a strategic arena or pivot area, especially in earlier times, or like some Arctic adverts places the place's value on mineral resources?
That's a very good question. I do have adverts from the heroic era and from also some of Admiral Byrd's expedition that are sort of promoting things like the oils that they were using, so not promoting Antarctica as a place for getting those oils necessarily, but using Antarctic imagery in those adverts for those companies. One thing that I do find very interesting as well is associated with Admiral Byrd and associated also with the Transantarctic expedition in the 1950s. There were actually board games produced, and those board games were very strategic, so trying to get to the pole or trying to claim different parts of land or get around the continent, depending on what the game actually was. So that was aimed at children, but that kind of links to these adverts because, at least in the case of Admiral Byrd, he was putting out these games and also advertising with grape nuts cereal, and it was all very, very interconnected.